Thank you very much, Minister Gramagna, for being with us here this afternoon and being generous in sharing your thoughts and very stimulating for our meetings ahead. So let's get started. And I would now like to turn you over to our host's Master of Ceremonies for this year's annual conference, Gabriel Boissante. I could give you his CV, but what I can say it's very fascinating. A mixture of a degree in entrepreneurship and management strategy, together with being an actor who has performed in about 30 films and plays. A very interesting mix. Also somebody who has much experience and has been entrusted with numerous presentations and MC roles in the commerce and finance sectors. So we're in good hands, and over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much. My resume is, I didn't know it was that impressive, but you could notice something that I don't know much about insurances. I'm very sorry for this, but there is one thing that I know. I know to recognize an audience of people that are there to exchange, to learn, and to enjoy a great conference over the next days. And trust me, I will do not only my best, but I will deliver to give you that good time and good timing between the different moments of this 25th conference of the IAIS. My role will be then to give you some housekeeping, not orders, but guidelines to introduce the different moderators and panels. So let me start with a little list of elements. I wanted to start actually also to tell you Moyen, but apparently this joke has been made already a couple of times, so I will just give you a little hint how to speak Luxembourgish. Take any English word, just try to say it slowly, without any roundness. Welcome is like welcome. So welcome, welcome to all of you in Luxembourg. This presentation is going to be completely recorded, so all the PowerPoints and the panel sessions will be available online on the IAIS website very soon. Also, in addition to the hard copy program that you can find in your badges, I'm talking about this program that you have all. You will find and you will have access to an app of the conference that will give you an access to the biography of all the panelists, moderators, and participants of this conference. All the contact and connection details are on this plan, so take a look at it. Also very important information, it gives you the precise location of the bar. It's an important detail. Of course, every panel, at the end of every panel session, you will have the opportunity as an audience to ask some questions. We will have some members of the organization that will go through the audience with microphones, so don't be shy, just raise your hand and we will come to give you the word. The moderator will be then the judge of the moment when the Q&A will be open into its panels. For those who are making a PowerPoint, this is going to be your best friend and maybe your worst friend if you push on the black button. So please, do not push the black button. I know we are nothing big, but maybe. So it's been highlighted twice on my notes, so please do not push the black button. No, I think that's a little bit of all the formal rules and guidelines. As Mr. Gramagna said, Vicky, you have been extremely short and brief, like our minister was. Not. Sorry, Pierre, he's a friend, I can say it. I will introduce now our first panel and our first session under the title Major Projects Update. And for me, it's a kind of an easy job to introduce the first moderator, as he's basically our host today and he started the welcome. Please welcome Jonathan Dixon back on stage to moderate the first session panel. Thank you very much. No, it's all on you. You will see me at the coffee break.
Excellent. Let me start here, and perhaps I can call up my panelists one by one. So this is a great opportunity to share with you, first of all, an update on some of our major projects, particularly those projects where, as I said, I describe them as our current commitments. These are projects that have been with us for a while, that we are very close to reaching finalization on. I can share with all of you, without sharing the details, but to say that we've had, I'm happy to say, 3 days of very productive and successful committee meetings, and we continue to make good progress. So I'm going to call up the panelists one by one, and in doing so, give you a little bit of, also use it as an opportunity to remind all of you that the panelists are our senior leadership, and they are leadership of our of 3 main parent committees, and that actually, as from 1 January this year, we have a new committee structure. So this is also an opportunity to remind everyone of this new committee structure that we operate under. So first of all, we have our Policy Development Committee, the PDC, which is chaired by Elise Liebers from the US NAIC, which is, as the name suggests, responsible for the development, review, and updating of our IAIS supervisory material. So our ICPs, our standards, our common framework for the supervision of internationally active insurance groups, or ComFrame, much easier, including our insurance capital standard, ICS. So, Elise, could you, excellent, join us on the stage? Secondly, we have our Macroprudential Committee, which is chaired by Alberto Corinti from Italy, which is responsible for steering our work on financial stability, including the development of an holistic approach to assessing and mitigating systemic risk in insurance, no small project, as well as our ongoing work on macroprudential monitoring, surveillance, assessment. So, Alberto, please. And then lastly, our Implementation and Assessment Committee. Many of you who've been here for a while would have known it used to be called our Implementation Committee. The extra words signify the additional importance that we're giving to assessment work going forward. So this is the committee chaired by Jose, or otherwise Pepe, Lopez Hoyo from Mexico, who's responsible for pursuing our high-level goals to support member implementation of our material, including assessment work, guidance on supervisory practices, promoting information exchange, and supervisory capacity building. So big welcoming hand to our panelists. And then very quickly, because we are running a bit behind time, I'm sorry, this might mean a shorter coffee break, early warning, about the organization of the panel. So as you'll see from the program, we have split it into 2 sessions. In the first session, we will have the update from our PDC and MPC, and then after the coffee break, the Implementation and Assessment Committee. The main thing to flag is we have left time for a Q&A session, and that will be at the end. So you'll have to save up your questions, I'm afraid, on MPC and PDC, and then we'll have that in the second half of the second session. So with that, I think, without further ado, I am going to hand it over to the chair of our PDC, Elise, to tell us about an update on the work of that committee. Thank you.
Okay. Well, moyen, everyone. I just wanted to try that with my Brooklyn accent and see how it sounded. It's a pleasure to be here today and provide you an update on the major projects this year for the Policy Development Committee. So in 2018, the PDC made progress on a number of projects, and I'll be addressing today the revisions to the Insurance Core Principles, or ICPs, the development of ComFrame, the Common Framework for the Supervision of Internationally Active Insurance Groups, the ICS, which is the Insurance Risk-Based Global Capital Standard, which is part of ComFrame, but I'll discuss that separately, and also the development of supporting material. I'll also provide a brief update on the aggregation method, additional data collection that we're doing as well. I would say that for those of you that are more familiar with our standard setting activities, you may be familiar with some of the things that I'm going to say, but actually this annual conference is really an opportunity to engage an even broader audience in some of our standard setting work. So thank you again in advance for your attention. Okay, so moving to the ICPs, and just to set the stage, you may recall that in 2016, the IAIS decided that revisions to the ICPs related to ComFrame will generally be adopted at the annual general meeting in 2019. And this is because while the work is still ongoing in ComFrame, we thought it best not to fully finalize the underlying ICPs. So ICP revisions completed prior to 2019 and endorsed by the Executive Committee are made available on the IAIS website as drafts released for information purposes only. The revised ICPs will be subject to further change for both consistency with ComFrame and as well due to the development of the holistic framework to mitigate systemic risk, which we'll hear more about later. Of course, there's no expectation for implementation of the draft ICPs before adoption at the annual general meeting. So just to level set the audience as to what happened last year, this slide points out which revised ICPs, not used as the foundation of ComFrame, were adopted at the annual general meeting in November of last year, and which ones were endorsed by EXCO as drafts. Specifically, ICPs 13, 18, 19 were adopted at the annual general meeting in November last year, whereas the introduction to ICPs, revised ICPs 1, 2, 3, 9, 10, 12, and 25, used as the foundation for ComFrame, were endorsed as drafts and published for information purposes only. Now, as regards this year, revised ICP, which is ICP 6, which is the change of control and portfolio transfer, is not one of the ICPs that's used as a foundation for ComFrame, and this was actually adopted this morning at our annual general meeting. And revised ICPs 8, 15, 16, and 20, which are used as a foundation for ComFrame, were endorsed as drafts by the EXCO yesterday and will be published soon for information purposes. Taking this opportunity, I would really like to thank you for your engagement on this in this process, both the members and the stakeholders, for all your comments. We've reviewed them very, very carefully, and I'd like to let you know that the working party chairs have commented how useful they were in finalizing the revisions to the ICPs. Soon you'll be able to see the revised version of the ICPs, as well as the resolution of the main public consultation comments. You'll also have a chance to learn more during a public discussion session that we plan for November 21. And today I'll provide you with just some high-level comments on this work. You'll see as I go through them that consistency with other ICPs, clarity, and avoiding duplication were the major drivers of the changes. So starting with ICP 6, revisions focused on streamlining and providing more helpful guidance. In response to public consultation comments, cross-border considerations were made and given more prominent place within the ICP. Regarding changes to ICP 8, those were focused on removing overlaps between ICP 8 and ICP 16. Redundant content was removed from the guidance, but some content was added back to the guidance that had previously been in the ComFrame material because it was thought to be applicable to a broader group of firms. As regards ICPs 15 and 16, many of these changes were geographical in nature. ERM-related terms to be included in the IAIS glossary were also consulted on. Based on feedback, a number of risk-related terms that were used in ICP 15 and 16 were endorsed to be added to the IAIS glossary. As regard a new standard, ICP 16.13 under ICP 16, in July of 2018, the EXCO endorsed moving the material on recovery planning from ICP 10, which is preventative measures and corrective measures and sanctions, to this standard. This was done also in response to public consultation comments and to reflect the fact that recovery planning is the responsibility of the insurer itself as part of the enterprise risk management and is aimed at enhancing its preparedness in advance of a severe stress event. As regards ICP 20, the purpose of the revision was again to address clarity and consistency on a number of issues that had been identified in the IAIS self-assessment and peer review findings that were done a few years ago, and also to add a new non-GAAP disclosure requirement for consistency with disclosures that are required of securities regulators. The public consultation resulted in some changes to remove direct references to requirements for supervisors where they lack the authority to meet the requirements, and as well as to eliminate the use of the word required in guidance. Again, to set the stage, last year the IAIS published a draft ComFrame material integrated into ICPs in 2 rounds of consultation, in March and in November. The outcome of the 2017 public consultations was communicated respectively in March and July of this year. In July of this year really marked a major milestone with the publication of the draft overall ComFrame consultation document. It was really the first time a complete and comprehensive overview of all the draft ComFrame materials was integrated into the ICPs. In addition, the ComFrame draft included some new elements. First, it had the IAIG identification criteria, which was previously included in Module 1 of the 2014 draft ComFrame. and it also included supervisory principles for the identification of the head of IAIG. This material also included amendments that reflected the Kuala Lumpur Agreement on the implementation of the ICS version 2.0 in ComFrame material in ICPs 9 and 25, as well as the ComFrame introduction. Public consultation comments were due October 30th. So it's pretty early to present even a preliminary outcome of the consultation, other than to say that in terms of volume, there were over 1,000 comments from about 30 stakeholders and 8 members. And we received a significant number of comments on ICP, in particular on ICP 16, 8, and 9, although I'm happy to say that in general, stakeholders expressed an interest in really all parts of ComFrame, but particularly 16, 8, and 9. In July, we also released the ICS version 2.0 consultation document. We're now reviewing the public consultation comments, and we're working on finalizing the ICS version 2.0 for adoption in 2019. Implementation of ICS version 2.0 will be conducted in 2 phases. So the first phase is referred to the monitoring phase, where the ICS will be used for confidential reporting to group-wide supervisors and for discussion in the supervisory colleges. It will not be used as a prescribed capital requirement during this time. This will allow the group-wide supervisors and the host supervisors to discuss and assess the ICS in comparison to existing capital standards and calculations that are in development. The monitoring period is expected to start in 2020 and last for 5 years. The second phase will be the implementation of the ICS as a group-wide PCR. Now, implementation of the ICS will also have 2 very important, equally important components. First is the mandatory confidential reporting by all IAIGs of a reference ICS, which is based on a single market-adjusted valuation, the standard method for capital requirements, and converged criteria for qualifying resources. And additional reporting at the option of the group-wide supervisor of ICS based on GAAP plus valuation and or other methods of calculation of the ICS capital requirement. Both the GAAP plus and internal model are considered viable options that will be considered for inclusion in the ICS by the end of the monitoring period. So this slide depicts how the 5-year monitoring period is envisioned to work. Building on the current field testing process and experience, the IAIGs and other volunteer groups will submit information to the group-wide supervisors for data quality and reasonableness checks. The information will then be sent to both the IS and the group's supervisory college. Focusing first on the left-hand side of the chart, the IS will maintain a working group similar to CSFWG to support the reporting of the reference ICS and any additional reporting, and to assess feedback on the ICS version 2.0. On the right side of the chart, we see that the members of an IAIG supervisory college will be expected to discuss and assess the reference ICS and any additional reporting as submitted to the group-wide supervisor during the monitoring period. The assessment of the reference ICS, and if applicable, the additional reporting, should include a comparison with existing group capital standards or calculations that are in development, the extent to which the material risks of the IAIG is captured, and the appropriateness and practicality of calculations required, and also any difficulties in implementing the measure by the IAIG. So then the question becomes, how do we get the feedback from the supervisory colleges back to the IAIS? And here we probably need to further consider the process. But what's envisioned is establishing a supervisory group that would be focusing on discussing the implementation of ICS 2.0 in the monitoring period, including this feedback from the supervisory colleges. And the supervisory group would be responsible for producing a report to PDC on the experience of the frontline supervisors with respect to the ICS. The role of the PDC and EXCO will remain the same during the monitoring period, and any recommendations from the Capital Insolvency Working Group will be first discussed at the Policy Development Committee and then on to the Executive Committee. Okay. This slide shows some changes that were introduced in the 2018 field testing. As the data analysis continues, the appropriateness of these changes will be assessed as we move forward toward finalizing the 2019 field testing and ICS version 2.0. So this year we had, in terms of valuation, we had only one approach tested, called the three-bucket approach. We did collect data on 3 additional discounting methods as well. For GAP Plus, we had a split between those GAP Plus jurisdictions doing a full ICS calculation and those that just presented a balance sheet only. We posed a number of qualitative questions as well. Third major area that would be under evaluation is the treatment of margins. So the margin over the current estimate. We also tested various flavors of the mochi, we refer to as mochi. In terms of capital resources, there was an open issue for 2018 field testing, which was related to the presence of acceleration clauses, the common in the debt instruments of U.S. insurers, and progress was made with respect to other capital resources, including the recognition of structural subordination, subject to a number of conditions being met. For capital requirements, we saw the introduction of the non-default spread risk within market risk. And for tax, we tested a refined approach for tax in 2018, whereby the amount of the ICS stress tax effect is capped by the value of the deferred tax liabilities. Let me also mention briefly that last year, the United States announced an important development in its regulatory regime, which was the development of an aggregation method to a group capital calculation. The IAIS recognized the aggregation method still in its early development, and the IAIS agreed to collect data from interested jurisdictions relevant to the development of the aggregation method. So although it's not part of ICS version 2.0, the IAIS appreciated the significance of this development, and so it agreed to collect data to help support it. The IAIS hopes that and aims by the end of the monitoring period to be in a position to assess whether the aggregation approach produces comparable outcomes to the ICS. And if so, it will be considered an outcome equivalent approach for implementation of the ICS as a PCR. The first aggregation method data collection, as I said, was launched this year. Data was due at the end of August. Volunteer groups from 5 jurisdictions submitted data, and analysis is ongoing at this point. So going forward, first as it relates to ICPs and ComFrame development, in the first half of 2019, we'll be reviewing the public consultation comments on overall ComFrame. At the same time, the IAIS will be working on further revisions to the ICPs where necessary for consistency with ComFrame development. The IAIS will also be working on revisions to the ICPs and ComFrame as part of the development of the holistic framework to mitigate systemic risk. And of course, we'll hear more about that from Alberto in just a minute. In June 2019, the IAIS will publish the summary of the main public consultation comments on overall ComFrame and their resolution. There will be another public consultation from June to August on revisions made to the ICPs and ComFrame for a 60-day period. All the revised ICPs as well as ComFrame and ICS version 2.0 will be adopted at the annual general meeting in November 2019. So it promises to be a very busy year. So turning here to the final slide, earlier this week, the PDC approved and the EXCO adopted 3 papers. The public consultation comments on the draft papers and their resolution will be published quite soon on the IAIS website. The outcome of the public consultation will also be discussed during the session that I mentioned earlier. That will be on November 21st. And I will provide just a brief presentation of the papers and encourage you to attend the discussion sessions for further details. The first is an issues paper on increasing digitalization in insurance and its potential impact on consumer outcomes. This was developed by the Market Conduct Working Group. The purpose of the paper is to consider the impact of increasing use of digital technology in insurance on consumer outcomes and insurance supervision in light of Insurance Core Principle 19 on the conduct of business with a focus on product design and underwriting along with marketing, sales, and distribution aspects of the insurance value chain. It considers consumer outcomes included in robo-advice, price comparison websites, and describes what digitalization means for insurance supervision. The next paper I'll describe is the application on the supervision of insurer cybersecurity. This was developed by our Financial Crimes Task Force. The paper is a follow-up to the issues paper on cyber risk in the insurance sector, which was published originally August 2016. The application paper is intended to provide further guidance to supervisors seeking to develop or enhance their approach to supervising cyber risk, cyber security, cyber resilience, and proposing supervisory practices for the insurance sector. Insurers are also invited to consider this application paper to assist in developing and implementing good cybersecurity practices in their organizations. Last but not least is the application paper on the composition and the role of the board, which was developed by the Governance Working Group. This paper aims to provide additional material to help with the practical interpretation and application of selected standards and guidance in ICP 5, which is suitability of persons, and ICP 7, which is corporate governance, considering particular challenges for achieving effectiveness in supervision of the board. And this was evidenced by the outcome of the self-assessment and peer review, which was conducted by the IAIS in 2014. I'll also mention IAIS is currently working on an application paper on recovery planning. This will be released for consultation probably in the next few days, and again will be part of the discussion on November 21. The development of the supporting material is overseen by the Implementation Assessment Committee, so I'm sure Pepe will provide you an update also in this regard. So that concludes my comments, Jonathan, and turn it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Elise. And as we can see, a very full year. Okay, well, I am going to turn straight over to Alberto to tell us about the work of the MPC, and after that, some coffee. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to give you some insights on the work of the Macroprudential Committee, knowing that I'm the obstacle between now and the coffee break. I'll try to be brief. Yeah. So, as most of you know, our main task is the development of an holistic framework for mitigation of systemic risk in insurance. I will say something about that in a moment, but I wanted just to highlight now that the committee is doing also other things, and in particular is continuing the annual GSII assessment exercise. We actually continued, like last years, to collect data and analyze those data in order to assess the systemic footprint of companies, of insurance companies. Actually, this year we asked even more data, and we are aware this was also an additional burden for companies, but those additional information has been used in order to develop our holistic framework. So I hope the sacrifice for the companies, participating companies, will be worthwhile. We also continue our activity in terms of macroprudential surveillance. We have a working group, the Macroprudential and Surveillance Working Group, dealing with macroprudential analysis. Now the analysis is mainly focused on the identifying risk and trends in the overall economy that could impact the insurance sector, and also to highlight the development within the insurance sector. Maybe in the future, in the light of the holistic framework, this type of activity will be complemented also by analysis aimed at defining what could be the potential impact of the insurance sector to the financial system. But coming to the systemic risk work plan, let me say that currently, as you know, the approach to systemic risk in insurance is based on a so-called entity-based approach that in a nutshell means that an assessment is done on insurers, and based on the systemic footprints of those insurers, a cohort of insurers is identified, and certain policy measures are applied only to those cohort of identified insurers. This is the approach that has been followed up to now. At a certain point, many people said that maybe this is not sufficient. We can have also systemic impact coming, for example, from a collective activities of many insurers. So for this reason, we have been in charge, we as a committee have been in charge in February 2017 to develop an holistic framework for mitigating systemic risk in insurance. This work stream actually, this plan actually included 3 work streams: the development of the so-called activity-based approach, so not anymore focused on the entities that have been identified, but on the activities that every type of companies could carry out. The second work stream was to improve the cross-sectoral consistency of our assessment, and the third was to review, as we are doing every 3 years, the assessment methodology in order to identify, as I said before, the systemic footprint of companies. In December 2017, we launched an interim consultation that was focused mainly on the first of those work streams. And I'm proud to say that in November we will launch a next consultation paper that actually brings together all those 3 work streams and present, even though in its most important line, what would be, in our view, the approach for mitigating systemic risk in insurance. And I'm very proud to say that today the association approved this consultation paper that will be issued next week. What you will see in this consultation paper, I cannot go into the details, but just for giving you some sense of what you will read, and then obviously we look forward to debate based on the consultation paper. First of all, why we call it holistic? Because we try to, as I said before, to complement the approach based on an entity-based with something which is mainly focused on the activities. And when we say activities, we are very keen to say that it's not the activity in itself that could be the source of systemic risk, but how the activity is managed that could be the source of systemic impact. And for this reason, in the consultation paper, we mainly refer to the risk exposure stemming from those activities and not the activity in itself. It is holistic also because we take into account not only, as in the traditional entity-based approach, what could be the impact on the system in case of failure of individual insurer, but we take into account also what could be the impact coming from collective risk exposure or activities. We are, as I said before, try to look at the cross-sectoral aspects, trying to see insurance sector not in isolation, but also in comparison with the systemic characteristics of other financial sectors. And it is holistic, this approach, also because the policy measure we are thinking about are focused on the risk exposure that I spoke before. And those risk exposure, are relevant both in case of propagation of, systemic risk through the failure of individual insurance, as well as through the activity of collective actions of companies that could not be necessarily have a solvency problems. So which are the key characteristics of this framework? We thought that for having a complete framework, we should not speak only about the policy measure, but also actions of supervisors, and in this context also a coordinating action of this association, of the IAIS. which is best placed in order to identify global systemic threats. So the objective of the framework was, first of all, to prevent systemic risk from materializing as far as possible. Second, to identify risk that could build up, notwithstanding those policy measures. And third, giving tools to the supervisor to address systemic threats in the case of their materialization. For this reason, you will see in the consultation paper, will be structured according to these different elements of the framework, a set of supervisory policy measures that have the purpose to mitigate the sources of systemic risk in terms of risk exposure. The second element that is there to highlight the fact that you need to monitor over time any materialization of the risk, as I said, notwithstanding those preemptive policy measures. And the third, that gives the supervisor the possibility to intervene when necessary. All those three aspects will be complemented by an activity of IAIS that, according to its strategy, will take actions to ensure that both policy measure and monitoring activity are applied in a consistent way across jurisdictions. The first paragraph, the first section of the consultation paper is actually based on a description of what in our view are the sources of systemic risk. And those sources of systemic risk, as I said before, are relevant overall, at least most of them, both in the case of a propagation of systemic impact through the failure of individual insurers, the so-called EBA approach, and a propagation based on the collective actions of more insurers that could have, in any case, an impact on the system. I will not go into the details here, but we try to be as analytic as possible in identifying which are the exposures, which are the transmission channels through which, under certain circumstances, for example, under certain shocks, you can have a potential impact on the system. And we try to also highlight what could be the potential impact. Again, here you see also some illustrative example of activities, but again, it's not an activity in itself that could lead to concerning exposure, but it is how the activity is managed. Based on the identification of those exposures that actually have been identified also thanks to the consultation that we did last year in our interim consultation paper, we designed a number of policy measures that are there in order to mitigate the possibility that those risk exposure go out of control and could lead to systemic impact. Let me say that those policy measures are sometimes the same policy measures that are normally implemented based on the current supervisory material in order to mitigate the risks. Liquidity risk, macroeconomic exposure, counterparty risk are both relevant in a micro perspective, that is to reduce the probability of failure of single companies and to protect the policyholders, but are also relevant for a more macroprudential approach. So overall, those policy measures are enterprise risk management qualitative requirements that have the purpose to mitigate the risk and to give incentive for a prudent management of the risk. Among those policy measures, there are also aspects regarding the crisis management and planning, and as well as the way in which the national supervisor carry out their macroprudential surveillance that, as you know, is currently the guidance which are standards which are included in ICP 24. So some policy measures will be targeted only to certain risk exposure, other as a broader applications. And those policy measures which, as I said, very often are enhancement of the policy measures that are already included in the supervisory material will be integrated in the ICPs and ComFrame, and if necessary, application papers will be also issued in order to improve the consistency of the application. The second element is the monitoring. Here I have to say that future work is still needed. So in 2019, we will continue to work on those subjects, but obviously we have to, first of all, define what is the annual data collection in order to detect, let's say, propagation of systemic risk for individual insurers, which is the traditional EBA approach, but also common exposure, if you want, or accumulation of risk across the sector that could have systemic impact in an ABA perspective. This collection of data that we will try to design in a way that is as less burden as possible for the companies, relying also on synergies, exploiting all the synergies also with other data collection that made by the IAIS, will provide the basis for the assessment of the IAIS. And also the assessment will be targeted both at identifying individual systemic threat and as well as collective systemic trends. There will be a mechanism for discussion of those, of the result of those assessments within IAIS, and both with regard to the assessment in itself, but also with regard to the policy measures that, or powers of intervention that potentially could be applied by the national supervisor. Finally, there will be, as in the case of other ICPs and ComFrame requirements, there will be an implementation assessment carried out according to the normal known tools put in place by the association in order to ensure the appropriateness and the consistency in the implementation of the requirement. This process will also help to check whether the policy measure itself should be developed or amended, and should also help to understand the effectiveness of those policy measures. Just to give an idea of the timeline, as I said, we will publish soon the consultation document that should give you the sense of the approach we think should be taken with regard to the mitigation of systemic risk in insurance. We will organize, if I'm not wrong, on the end of November, on the 29th of November, a public background section via teleconference for explaining a bit better than I've been able to do here the consultation. There will be a consultation period, and next year we will focus first of all on the policy measure, that is the integration of what we design in the holistic framework into concrete amendments of the ICPs and ComFrame, and this will be put under consultation in June 2019. So you will see again the concrete, if you want, amendments to the ICPs and ComFrame stemming from this work. And hopefully in November 2019, we will be able to issue both the revised ICPs and ComFrame, as well as the final design of the holistic framework. The holistic framework will be obviously put under revision, and we expect that there will be a revision in after 3 years of implementation, and the implementation is expected to put in place in 2020. So I'm sure we will have other occasion to speak about this holistic framework, and look forward also to your questions. Thank you very much.
So this is going to be extremely brief. The promised coffee break is now, and we will see each other in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much for the end of the first session of Panellists. Thank you.